June 27th, 1976, a flight from Tel Aviv, Israel, was hijacked. A Palestinian terrorist, when they landed in Tunisia, released all of the non-Jewish passengers. They would later move to Entebbe, Uganda, with this request: 50 Palestinian prisoners in Israel must be released, or all 105 Jewish passengers would be executed in 5 days. Israel mounted what would become historic as a rescue effort, landing a crack team of military experts at the Entebbe airport, sneaking them into the airport lounge where the prisoners were held. I'll let Arthur Karuvela finish it from there. Israeli forces landed at the Entebbe covertly. An assault team entered the terminal where the captives were being held. Through a megaphone, they entered and yelled both in Hebrew and English, "Stay down! Stay down! We're Israeli soldiers!" Whether it was the military training that all Israeli citizens have or just obedience to the command, without a murmur, all hit the deck. All landed on the floor. All except for one. Jean-Jacques Moumouni actually stood up when the disturbance began. As was planned, however, the raiding party began firing at whoever was remaining standing. Jean-Jacques Moumouni became the only casualty Israeli citizen of the raid of Entebbe. He was killed along with 7 hijackers. It was not enough for Moumouni to hear and understand the demand of the commandos. For their command to profit him, he had to obey. We have spent 12 weeks learning about a life God blesses, pursuing the kinds of things that God in His Word has promised to bless. As we wrap up our series this morning from the book of Nehemiah, we'll look at chapter 1 this morning. I want us to recognize that it is not just in hearing what God blesses that brings blessing. It is in doing what God blesses that brings blessing. And so let me challenge us today that we would take what we've learned over the last 3 months, believe it or not, it's been that long so quickly, and we would begin to put into practice in our lives these things that God has blessed. In fact, let me remind you the entire theme or thesis of this series over the last several weeks. It's this: we are to pursue the things God blesses rather than praying that God blesses the things we're pursuing. We are to determine through a study of the Word of God, our involvement in church life, godly counsel from men and women around us, what are the kinds of things that God blesses, and we are to set the sail of our lives on those things. We are determined to pursue in our lives those things that God has promised to bless. And this morning, as we wrap up this series, let me remind us of one final thing that God has promised to bless. God blesses perseverance. God blesses perseverance. To persevere is to continue in an action or a course of action in spite of obstacles. It is to persist. It is to refuse to give up and to quit. And the Scriptures teach that God blesses those who persevere. Nehemiah chapter 1 is where we'll take a look at that. Let me remind you as you're turning there to read Nehemiah's story. Nehemiah really is, the book is his journal. It's his experiences accomplishing one of the great tasks of the Old Testament. Nehemiah will stand as a hero because he will rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But as we're on our way there, let me remind you what it is. Over the last 12 weeks we've talked about that God blesses. What are those kinds of things in our lives that we ought to be pursuing, confident of the fact that God will bless that pursuit? God blesses faith, trust in Him. God blesses obedience. God blesses integrity. God blesses devotion, courage, prayer, humility, generosity, and as Pastor Austin preached so effectively last weekend, God blesses surrender. We will discover today that as we pursue those things, God also blesses when we refuse to give up. God blesses perseverance. Nehemiah chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. Did you find Nehemiah? Okay, I don't hear many pages turning, but you're on your phone and you found Nehemiah, right? All right, good. Keep it there. And so Nehemiah 1:1, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, which tells us about nothing about him. So let me fill in some blanks before we get into the narrative. Nehemiah will stand as a transitional figure, really cast a large shadow of Old Testament history. He lived about 150 years after the fall of Jerusalem. He didn't even live in Jerusalem. His great-great-great-great-grandparents had been deported at the destruction of Jerusalem, and he grew up in Babylon. In fact, he had a high responsibility in the palace in Susa for the king, Artaxerxes of Babylon. But Nehemiah lived 150 years removed from the fall of Jerusalem. About 80 years prior to Nehemiah's time, God in His grace had allowed the temple to be rebuilt, so that now Jerusalem, that jewel of the Old Testament, lay in ruins. Walls broken down. Very few people living there. About the only way you would know that there was life in Jerusalem is there was this temple that had been built. Wasn't as magnificent as Solomon's, wasn't as much gold or silver, but it was built. And it was designed to be a renewal of hope for the people of God. But in the 80 years since it had been rebuilt, still the walls were broken down. Still very few settlers lived in Jerusalem. There was threats. If raiding parties came in, no way to defend that. Who's going to live there? And so the worship of God suffered, and that's the way we find ourselves when Nehemiah gets word of that. Look at the end of verse 1. Now it happened in the month of Kislev, it's early December, so very likely around this time of year. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th, the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the capital, Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. Hey, I wanted to know, what's it like back there? Now, likely he had already heard. There was a lot of travel back and forth from Babylon to Jerusalem. There was a thriving Jewish community in Babylon, and there was Jews all around Jerusalem, but very few that lived in Jerusalem. Nehemiah is going to hear news that is not really new to him. It's certainly not new to the people that have lived there for 150 years since the fall of Jerusalem. Verse 3, and they said to me, the remnant there is in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire, which was news to no one. Remember, it was Babylon that had done that. That's commemorated on historical documents we have access to today. But look at Nehemiah's response. Nehemiah's response sets him apart as a man who will make a difference for God's people, beginning in verse 4. As soon as I had heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Although these were facts that were well known, there was something about this time, something about the news delivered face to face. It broke Nehemiah. He'll spend the next 4 months fasting and praying and weeping and seeking God's face to do something about that. And pick it up in chapter 2, verse 1. In the month of Nisan. Now that's not a kind of car. That is the month of April. So do the math. At least 4 months have gone by from December all the way around January, February, March, and now here we are, the early part of April. And in the month of Nisan, he has a chance to stand before the king. That was his job. He was a trusted advisor. He was cupbearer. He tested the food so the king didn't get poisoned without Nehemiah knowing about it first. And he stood before the king, and the king noticed that he was downcast. He was bothered by something. And the king asks him a question. Look at verse 4. What are you requesting, Nehemiah? The king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Now think about this. You ever been in a situation where somebody puts the pressure on you and you're like, God help me? That's what it is, just a quick prayer. And are those prayers effective? Well, sure, especially when you spent the last 4 months seeking God's faith and praying and planning. And so, verse 5, I said to the king, if it pleases the king and if your servant has found favor in your sight, here's what I request. That you would send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. That's a bold ask. Well, what are you wanting? I want to leave your service, king. I know I'm your trusted advisor. I know you can trust me, but I want to leave. And I want to go hundreds of miles away to a city your ancestors destroyed, and I want to rebuild it. It's a pretty big request. Look at what comes next in verse 6. The king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone and what will you return? Now, let me just say, if you go to your boss and you say, listen, I want a green light for this project, and he says, well, how long is it going to be and when are you going to get done with it? That's a good sign. I mean, you didn't get the door slammed in your face immediately. And so Nehemiah, look at the end of verse 6. It pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. By the way, question, how did Nehemiah know how long? Because those 4 months that he had been praying and weeping, he had also been planning and dreaming. He wasn't just frozen by heartbreak. He was saying, and I plan to do something about that. And in this case, God went before him and opened the door for him to do that. He knew how long, he knew when. And take a look at the next verse. I love this, verse 7. He asked for 2 more things. I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. I need safe passage. I need a passport. I'm going to go through about 3 different provinces to get there, and I want to have the king's seal that I'm there by your authority. And then a second thing he asked for that the king didn't offer to begin with. Verse 8, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I'm going to build for myself, the house that I'm going to occupy, the governor's mansion. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. A king, I need not only a passport, I need your credit card, and I need the gold one with no limit. And the king said, all right, you've got it. Now, look at chapter 2, fast forward to verse 17. He travels. That took another probably 6 weeks or so of travel. By the way, he gets to Jerusalem, and he doesn't say anything to anyone for 3 days. On the night of the third day, going into the fourth day, he tours the walls. He wants to see the damage for himself, but under the cover of darkness. When we get to verse 17, it's now the morning of the fourth day. He's called the people together. And you understand, in a small town where there's sort of just a few people living there, you've heard that a really high official all the way from the capital city is here. And he's been here for 3 days saying nothing. We're dying to know what's going on. Why are you here? And now he's gathered us together for a meeting. And so he calls this meeting, verse 17. I said to them, you see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Now stop for a minute. These people had lived their entire lives there. But you wonder, just like in our homes, if they didn't for the first time say, well, Shazam, he's right. It's a mess around here. When I was first married, I had a lot of learning to do. Now, I still have some learning to do, but one of the lessons that stuck with me early on was don't step over the trash bag that's placed in front of the back door. I would step over this with rising frustration, like, why is it every Thursday night there's a trash bag at my back door? And one conversation helped clarify that. And I learned you don't step over trash bags. You pick them up and take them out to the trash can. Well, this is the conversation Nehemiah is having. Hey, guys, look around. Why are you living with rubble all around? And so he points out the need, and then look at the middle of verse 17. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. And then he tells them, here's why I'm here. Here's how I got here. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. And think about what's accomplished so far. Nehemiah's had his heart broken, his dreams inspired. He's been given safe passage by the king, and he's been given the king's credit card. He's now surveyed the damage, and he's put together the team to do the work. So here's my question for you. What has been accomplished so far? Nothing. Nothing has been accomplished so far. No rubble removed, no stones built. You and I need persistence. We need to persevere because God's going to break our hearts. He's going to stir a dream. We're going to feel like we've got green light for circumstances and maybe even resources. And then guess what? Nothing's going to happen. You're even going to have people around you say, I think that's a great idea. I'd like to help make it happen. And still, nothing is going to happen. So all indicators headed up. It's going to take someone like Nehemiah to say, all right, we've planned it, we've provided for it, now let's do it. What happens in chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6 is a 6-month odyssey of frustration, pushback, despair, deception, open conflict, lying and deceit, and success. Chapter 3, we're not going to spend any time in. It's just a list of all the workers and where do they work and what kind of work do they do. And chapters 4 and 6 are like parentheses. They talk about outside conflict. Those that lived outside of Jerusalem, what was their attitude towards this concept of building the wall? And they're going to face all kinds of challenges. We'll take a look at a couple examples of that. Chapter 5, bracketed by 4 and 6, chapter 5 is about the internal conflict. In other words, even though the people said, yeah, let's go do this thing, as they actually began pursuing and doing the work, conflict and misunderstanding and hurt began to arise. So let's take a look at what happened here. Chapter 4, this is all about the conflict on the outside. Let me list to you some of the conflict, then we'll take a look at 2 examples of that. They faced ridicule. They faced intimidation. They faced personal threats and deception. Let's look at the ridicule. Look at chapter 4, verse 1. Nehemiah 4, verse 1. Now when Sanballat is a governor of the next province over, Samaria, just north, and he was not happy that Jerusalem was beginning to get some attention from the king. And so Sanballat heard that we were building the wall. He was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria. So think in terms of there's a bunch of guys making fun of what Nehemiah's idea was to rebuild the wall. They are ridiculing the very idea. And what are these feeble Jews doing? Look at verse 2. Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that? You ever, don't say it out loud. You ever know people like this? Buzz, kill. My dream, my joy, that which I'm going to do, their response is, you'll never make it. Can't do it. You don't have the resources, you don't have the skills. That's Sanballat. And then look at what comes next, verse 3. Tobiah the Ammonite, he decided he'd get in on the fun too, and he was beside him, and he said, yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Oh, if a little fox walks across it, it's going to tumble. It's a terrible idea. You guys don't have the skill, and what you're going to build is going to be a rickety old thing that will fall down. Mark it down. You're going to pursue God's calling on your life. There will be those outside who are going to ridicule you for that. How do we respond to that? Well, the next 2 verses, what I call the prayers of an angry man. When was the last time you prayed angry? We should do that once in a while. You know that, right? When we learn what's at stake and we recognize the threats to what God's called us to do, we ought to be angry about it. And so look at the prayer. Look at verse 4. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. I'm telling you, Nehemiah felt deeply the ridicule. That sense of shame was the very thing God had sent him all the way from Babylon to repair in Judah. Turn back their taunt on their own heads. Give them up to be plundered in a land where they're captives. Help them to understand what we feel like, Lord. Turn that right around on them. Do not cover their guilt. Let not their sin be blotted out from your sight. They have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. Pray those prayers. You go before God and you say, God, I know you've called me, you set me to do this thing, and there are those coming against me, and I pray, God, you would deal with them. Boy, what a relief that is to pray those prayers. And it wasn't just that ridicule, there were direct threats, and then look at chapter 6, verse 10. There was also deception. This is a little harder to identify and deal with. Chapter 6, verse 10. Now, when I went into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Deliah, the son of... Are there no Davids or Johns or Marys in this list, right? So all these guys, he goes into he's seeing this guy, whatever his name was, and He was confined to his home, and he said, interesting, by the way, he was confined to his home. He was already sort of shut up about something, and verse 10, and let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. That's a pretty direct threat, right? Nehemiah, they're coming to kill you. Look at the rest of verse 10. They are coming to kill you by night. You're not going to know, Nehemiah. You're going to be asleep and helpless. When do we turn on the alarms in our house? At night. When were they coming after him? At night. What do you do about that? Look at Nehemiah's response. Verse 11. But I said, should such a man as I run away? It's not a statement about how great Nehemiah is. It's a statement about how great the cause is. Dads, our decisions have impact on our children. So shall such a man as I run away from this problem? How we deal with direct threats, even to our safety, says something about how important the calling on our life is. Look at Nehemiah's next words. What man such as I could go into the temple and live? How much work on the wall was going to get done if Nehemiah was shut up in the temple? How much work? None. God had called Nehemiah to do a very clear thing. And he said, a man like me will not back down from that fight. Perseverance. Dads, men, what is it in our lives we're willing to face the fight for? What is it in our lives that say, I am not going to stay at home and lock my door? I'm turning off the TV, I'm turning off the radio, and I am leaning into this because God has called me to do this thing. Shall such a man as I run away? Moms, what task has God called you to do? And you say, I'm not going to run away from that task, even when it's a threat to me personally. This is perseverance. In fact, look at Nehemiah's flash of insight. Verse 12. At the end of verse 11, he says, I will not go in. I'm not leaving the wall. Verse 12, and I understood and saw that God had not sent him. That's good. That flash of insight came because Nehemiah remembered. He remembered consistently. We're going to find it all throughout this text. He remembered what God had called him to do was build a wall, not hide in a temple. Man, remember that. All right, well, I said that there was external and internal pressure, so let's take a look at the internal, chapter 4, verse 10. It's fatigue. And just the workers got tired. 4 verse 10, in Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves we'll not be able to build the wall. Listen, this is why it requires perseverance. We feel like we're going to fail. There was fatigue. There was discouragement. Much of chapter 5 is about internal conflict. Some were taking advantage of others, and you're going to find that even within those who are close to you. And there was complaining, divisions. Look at chapter 6, verse 5. This is the kind of the last little bit of the conflict he faced, and it impacted both external, that outside conflict, and internal. And I can't help it. I can't help myself. I think this is funny, right? And so, in the same way, Sanballat, so there's our bad guy, right? Sanballat, for the 5th time, you think that our critics don't have some persistence? For the 5th time, sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. What's an open letter? It means before he tried to deliver it quietly, this time he hired somebody who was a spokesman to read the letter out loud so everybody doing the work could hear. That's an open letter. And I love the open letter, right? It is reported among the nations. And I just love this next phrase. And Geshmu also says it's true. Well, if Geshmu says so, I mean, my two questions are this. Who in the world is Geshmu, and who cares what he says? Nobody cares what he says. Look at end of that verse, verse 6. You and the Jews intend to rebel. That's why you're building a wall. Look at verse 8. I don't care what Geshmu says. I don't care what your open letter says. I don't care this is the 5th time you've come to spread rumors among my people. I sent to him saying, no such things as you are saying has been done. You are inventing them out of your mind. You wanted to frighten us. What do you do when people make stuff up about you? Well, talk to them directly about it and then keep on building the wall. In fact, look at verses 15 and 16. Every time Nehemiah faced conflict, external, internal, deception, deceit, whatever it was, every time he responded the same way. Think carefully, speak directly, and persevere in what God has called you to do. So look at verse 15 of chapter 6. So the wall was finished on the 25th day in the month of Elul, which is September. So from April, when they began the planning and the clearing of the rubble, till the time the thing was done, in 6 months this thing's wrapped up. Look at verse 16. When our enemies heard it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their esteem. For they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. They are done. Wall is built. Love that. Now, before we wrap it up with a quick peek at chapter 12 and how they celebrated, let me talk to you a few minutes about how do we put into place some of the lessons that Nehemiah taught us on perseverance. And I think there are at least 3. Let me at least divide them into 3 categories. The first is this: perseverance begins in our heart. Perseverance begins in our heart. Feed it regularly. Twice in this section, chapter 2 and chapter 7, Nehemiah says these words: God had put this into my heart to do. If I don't miss my guess, some of you are saying, Scott, I get the value of perseverance. I'm not sure what it is I'm supposed to persevere toward. So can I give you 2 indicators of things that God may be calling you to do? First one is this: what is breaking your heart? For 150 years, people had known that Jerusalem was in rubble. They knew that. They knew the walls were down. Nothing changed until Nehemiah's heart was crushed at the thought of the shame that came with that beautiful temple being open to all kind of ravaging from the armies around about. And he spent months crying about that. What can't you live with? What about your family, your job, our church, this community, our nation so breaks your heart that you at times weep about it? Very likely that's something God is putting in your heart to say, you know what? Why don't you do something about it? The second clarifying question when it comes to keeping our hearts clear on what it is God's calling us to persevere in: what do you dream about? See, Nehemiah, he's such a great example of leadership because he didn't just sit there weeping about his, bad luck in Jerusalem. He spent also 4 months planning, thinking, dreaming. And when the opportunity came from the king said, what are you asking? He not only knew the 2 requests, he added 2 more requests, and he got all 4. So, what gets you up early? What makes you stay up late as you dream? You say, if only I had, then I could, just focus on the I could. There's your dream. There's your passion. There's your thing that God's calling you to persevere in. What breaks our heart, that about which we dream, clarifies for our heart where we should persevere. And we've got to feed that regularly. I mean, when Geshmu came to talk to him about it, he says it's true, build a wall. When Sanballat said all the threats, build a wall. When the people began to complain, build a wall. By the way, I'm not running for president, and that is not a statement at all of my political ambitions. I'm just saying this is what Nehemiah was called to do, all right? Are we clear that my heart is hot for this thing. And I will feed that. That's where perseverance begins. It doesn't begin in the doing, it begins in the thinking and the dreaming and the hurting and the heartbreak. And look for that. Second, perseverance withers in the fog. See your purpose clearly. Perseverance withers in the fog. See your purpose clearly. What do you mean by that, Scott? What do you mean by the fog? Well, I was working through this message this week, and I kind of got to this second point, and I wasn't clear on it. I had coffee with a man I respect, and what I was doing basically, honestly, was getting to catch up with him, but also lay out some things over the next year or so. And by the way, I think 2017 is going to be a whale of a year for our church. And so just laying this out and wanting his feedback. I want to find out where the weakness is, where are the strengths, what should I be thinking about. And then we moved on to some other things, like why do people struggle so often, sort of persevering, because I told him about the topic. And he said, people tend to struggle with the fog. I said, wait, okay, what do you mean? It's like it was a nice day what do you mean the fog? He said, well, you're moving along, you're going along, it gets foggy, you see shapes off in the distance, you don't know, is that an obstacle, is that an opportunity, is this the way to go, is that the way to go? That's a great analogy. It's a great word picture. Some of us have a tendency when the Sanballats or the conflict or the Gashmus begin to talk to get foggy. We begin to lose sight. What has God called us to do? So let me see if I can maybe clarify that a little bit. Clarify the fog. Perseverance, by perseverance, I'm not saying we never quit. By perseverance, I'm not saying we never fail. The reality is that you and I are going to fail. The reality is that businesses close. The reality is that companies go bankrupt. People lose their homes. The reality is in marriage we have a bad week or a bad year. And our children have bad days or months or decades. It's not about never failing. It's not about never quitting. People fail classes. People move job to job. I get that. That's not what I'm talking. When I talk about perseverance, it's refusing to quit on that thing God has called you to do and to be. Well, that business may fail, but there may be another one. Some of you have had the pain of going through divorce, the loss of a spouse. Maybe it was not your decision. Are we going to let that define us? Perseverance says, whatever I face now, in spite of the failures of the past, I will continue to follow God's calling on my life. So, parents, when it's hard and the kids don't respond the way we want, perseverance says, I'm not giving up on you. I will rear you in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, because that's what God's called me to do. In our marriages, when spouses don't respond the way we think they should, I will not give up on that, because God has called me to be sanctified in this most personal of relationships I have. And my job, I lose a job, I will not give up working towards productivity in my life, and I'll find a better job or a better business or a better plan. That's what I mean about perseverance. When we fall into sin, we refuse to allow that to define our destiny. The righteous person responds to unrighteousness in a righteous way. And we learn to persevere through the sin to the sanctifying power of God to correct and to restore and to renew. So as I think about this idea of perseverance, the fog will wither that perseverance. Are you perfectly clear on what it is God has called you to be and to do? Mom, dad, husband, wife, child, employer, employee, church member. Let's not spend all of our time focusing on the problems, the Gashmus, and the Sanballats. Let's spend a lot of our time focusing on what God has called us to do. Third, perseverance blossoms with friends. Choose them wisely. Perseverance blossoms with friends. Choose them wisely. Look at chapter 7 and verse 1. Okay, so the wall's done. That job's completed. What do you do now? Well, you're going to have to run a city now. Chapter 7, verse 1. when the wall had been built and I had set up the doors and the gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites had been appointed, I gave my brother Hanani and Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem. Why, Nehemiah, did you put these guys in charge of Jerusalem? For he was a more faithful and God-fearing man than many. We need friends who refuse to let us give up on following God's calling in our lives. We need friends who are beside us, arm around a shoulder, walking with us. And we need some friends who are behind us, pushing us forward. And you need a few friends who are in front of you and pulling you along, even at times when you don't have the faith to go forward yourself. Not only will you feel insufficient for the task, not only will you face decisions about what to do after failure, those around you will doubt you and criticize you. So you'll want to look this up on your phone after the service. I'll give you the title. It's called The Arena. It's a speech given by President Theodore Roosevelt, Sorbonne, France, 1906, April 10th. He said this: "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end triumph and high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." What is it that God has called us to persevere in? What have you been tempted to quit at, or have you quit at? Let me encourage you, in fact, let me challenge you to pick it up again, not to give up. Let me invite the worship team to make their way back up here, and let me invite you to turn to Nehemiah chapter 12. Nehemiah chapter 12, I want you to see what happened at the very end of this. I want you to see the celebration. I want you to see where we can go when we persevere. But as you're turning there, I want you to see also Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 36. You want to project that for us? Probably what you don't need from me is another message. Probably what you don't need from me are 10 more subpoints. Here's what we need. This is under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, so I know it's an accurate picture. You have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Perseverance is really led by the lockdown conviction God will keep His promise. And so Nehemiah found, let's look at chapter 12, verse 31. Love this. So then I brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall and appointed 2 great choirs to give thanks. Now wait. Help me understand. I brought the leaders of Judah where? Where? Not to the wall. Where at? On the wall. I love that. He divided the troops into 2 categories. He had 2 marching bands put together, and then he had all the officials, the city officials, talk about some personal buy-in, and he said, we're marching on top of the wall. Love that. Tell me a fox is going to knock it down. Look at 31. I brought the leaders of Judah onto the wall. I appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. One went to the south on the wall. Look at verse 38 rather. The other choir of those who gave thanks went to the north. Look down at verse 43. So you have these hundreds of people, men and women, marching on the wall, celebrating with their loud noise, and they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. You get the theme of joy and joy and joy? Now listen. The women and the children also rejoiced because the kids were running around. Moms were trying to make sure they don't fall off the wall, and they were celebrating that. And now look at the last phrase. The joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Why do you suppose that last phrase is in there? Who do you think heard the joy of Jerusalem? Who do you think looked up and saw, what is there a parade doing marching around that wall? How about Sanballat, who said, and Tobiah, who said, a fox will make it fall? Now, I've got a bit of a sanctified imagination. I am absolutely convinced that Nehemiah, as he marched on that wall, he marched around and he was looking at them and he was saying, see this right here? Celebrate. Listen, listen, listen. Persevere. Live for the joy that you will find when you have finished that which God has called you to do. And do not quit. Do not give up too soon. We will reap if we do not faint. Let me pray for you. Father, I pray for men and women here today that those who are heavy with discouragement would find the strength to persevere. That those whose hopes are dimmed in the fog of discouragement or confusion would rediscover that thing to which you have called them, that role that they are called to fulfill, that a man or a woman such of them would not hide, but would face it. Father, I pray that as you did for Nehemiah, you would go before us and give us the favor of our supervisors, of those who need to grant us the permission we need to move forward. Father, I pray that we would plan and pray and weep over those things that you have called us to be and to do. God, I pray that with Nehemiah, we would rejoice when you have given us the desires of our heart. In the meantime, we will persevere, we will not quit, we will come alongside others and encourage them as well, because that's what you've called us to do. Thank you, Lord, for your faithfulness to us, that Jesus Christ never has given up and will never forsake us. We love you because you first loved us. We ask this in Jesus' name, and all God's people said,